It's time for the Science Cafe!
Learn about the latest technologic innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Did we mention it's free?
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
Hello, and welcome to our 7th virtual session of Science Cafe New Hampshire. Since 2011, we have been bringing together ordinary people with scientific experts to talk about the issues and answer questions of importance to all of us. My name is Rick Irving, and I am the moderator, and I will be your host for this evening. Tonight's topic is space travel, surviving the trip. Thanks for being with us again as we explore space travel and the many challenges involved in leaving the planet. Science Cafe is all about answering your questions. The questions come from you, the audience. To submit your questions, please use the comment section of Facebook Live or YouTube, whichever you are using to watch us tonight. And please be specific and precise with the question part of your comment. We will pass along the questions to our panel. The format for this evening will be, I will introduce briefly the panelists to you. Then we will give each one of them 3 or 4 minutes to tell us about themselves, their background, their interests, and their work. The first question of the evening will be, what do you think is the biggest, toughest challenge space travel presents? Then we will go right into the question and answer session for the remainder of the time that we have available, minus a couple of comments that we have at the end. We have an excellent panel for you this evening, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say and to help us tell the difference between science and science fiction. Okay, hello. Now we are at the point where we can actually introduce the panel. So I will start with Susan Bailey. Susan is a PhD in biomedical sciences. She's a professor of radiation, cancer, biology, and oncology at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. She was also selected by NASA to do a twins study, and the subject of those twins were identical twin astronauts Scott and Mark Kelly on their 1-year mission aboard the International Space Station. So Susan, I'm so glad you could join us tonight. Would you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you so much. It's for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you this evening, even if it is in a virtual format. It's always fun to talk about space. I mean, there's lots to be excited about with our space program. Certainly, all the most recent things with SpaceX and NASA, but also, you know, a lot of the current excitement started with the NASA's first 1-year mission, and their first 1-year mission astronaut was Scott Kelly, who just so happened to have an identical twin brother, Mark Kelly, who you might recognize now as being in political life as a senator from Arizona. But they were the subjects of the twin study, and we were selected for that study to look at telomeres, to study telomeres and use that as a biomarker of aging. It's funny how, I mean, Scott and Mark were so interviewed through those years, and one of the questions that was often asked of them was, well, would Scott return younger than Mark? Because of, you know, the theory of relativity and all of that stuff. So, of course, that's not really true in low Earth orbit on the space station, but except for maybe just a few milliseconds. But it was really an honor to participate in that study. And we measured telomere length before, during, and after spaceflight in both of the twins. And we did that because telomeres are, you know, markers of aging. They shorten with age. They shorten with all kinds of stresses, like the stresses of strapping yourself to a rocket, or, you know, we just imagined all these the physical, nutritional stresses that they might be under would influence telomere length, as well as exposures. So exposures to the extreme environment of space, we imagine would certainly work to shorten telomeres. So, radiation part of it was a very big deal for us. And we also measured biomarkers of DNA damage. So we looked at chromosome aberrations in both of the twins as well. So those really are my main interests. I mean, telomeres and how they participate and contribute to aging and how we might improve that process, but also what the influences of ionizing radiation, particularly in the space radiations that astronauts experience when they're in space, are also of great interest to us. And so we're interested not only in the ends of our chromosomes, the telomeres, but we're also interested in the rest of the chromosome and how radiation exposures might damage them. And I'll just quickly mention that we had the twin study, and then we also had a cohort of 10 unrelated astronauts that we did very similar studies in, and those reports just came out in Cell and Cell Reports. So a whole bunch of different papers recently came out across Cell Press reporting on all kinds of different endpoints. And going forward, we'll be looking at a whole new cohort of astronauts that are going to be on the International Space Station for a variety of different length missions.
Well, thank you, Susan. I'm glad you could join us. I'm actually looking very much forward to hearing you talk about this as we go on.
Thank you.
Next, we have Laura Barger, who's a PhD. She's an assistant professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School. She's also a research fellow and associate physiologist at the Division of Sleep and Circadian Disorders in the Department of Medicine and Neurology at Brigham and Women's Hospital here in Boston. Laura, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thanks for having me and inviting me to be on this panel. What we study in the Division of Sleep Medicine is work hours and sleep deficiency in a bunch of safety-sensitive occupations. So we've worked with police officers, firefighters, the federal air marshals, maritime bar pilots, resident physicians, and we look and see how those work hours and resultant sleep deficiency affect health and safety outcomes. We had the privilege of studying sleep and circadian rhythms on the astronauts over a decade. And I was really interested in doing this. I am interested in aviation and space flight. I was a navigator on a KC-135, retired from the Air Force doing that. And so we got this grant to study sleep on the astronauts. Like I said, we studied a decade over the space shuttle and the construction of the ISS. And we had over 80 missions where we collected sleep data on the shuttle and 21 astronauts on ISS missions. And then we also studied the sleep of the astronaut and the cosmonaut on the 1 year long mission as well. In thinking going to Mars, we haven't studied anybody on Mars, but we were able to study a group of scientists and engineers who were living on the Mars Sol during the Phoenix Mars lander mission. So while the spacecraft was on Mars, the support engineers and scientists were living on the 24.6 hour day. So that is like traveling across 2 time zones every 3 days continually. So they did this for about 3 months, and we were able to look at circadian rhythms and recommend some lighting countermeasures to help them adapt to that, which astronauts might have to do in the future. So I'm excited to answer any questions you have about sleep or circadian rhythms during spaceflight.
Great. Thank you, Laura. I can't wait to hear about the results that you found there. I should mention for the audience that Susan is joining us from Fort Collins, Colorado, and Laura is joining us from California. Next, we have Jay Buckley, physician, BSEE from Cornell, as well as his MD. He is a professor of medicine at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth University here in Western New Hampshire. And he is also a former NASA astronaut. He flew a mission aboard the space shuttle as a payload specialist. We are very interested to hear your comments on this. Jay, could you tell us about yourself?
Yes, thanks. Thanks for having me on. It's Bucky, actually, no L.
Bucky. Oh, yep.
Yep.
Sorry.
So I'm a professor of medicine at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth here in New Hampshire. And my interest is in the biomedical problems that prevent long-duration spaceflight, meaning the barriers to human missions to Mars. And I've been involved in that for many years, including the opportunity to fly in space on a mission that was totally devoted to studying the brain and nervous system in space, a mission called Neurolab. And it flew back in 1998 and was totally devoted to studying the brain and the nervous system. And then since then, we've done research in various different areas related to space physiology and medicine. And I also wrote a book about physiology called Space Physiology. And so that's always been an interest of mine, and I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Great. That's fantastic. Obviously, you have experience that very few of us ever get to have, and maybe none of our audience has in actually being an astronaut. And next we have Faisal Karmali. Faisal, let me get my notes here, is the assistant professor of Otolaryngology. How'd I do?
Otolaryngology.
Otolaryngology.
ENT for short.
Head and neck surgery at the Harvard Medical School. He's also the co-director of the Jenks Vestibular Physiology Laboratory at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Facility. And he has recently had some collaborations with a lot of universities, MIT, Ohio State, University of Houston, University of Colorado, and also with NASA. So, Faisal, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so following in the footsteps of Jay and space physiology, I'm particularly interested in what we call the vestibular system. And those are the organs in the ear which sense how we move through space. Obviously, they're very important during space travel. They drive a few different reflexes in our body. One is called the vestibular ocular reflex. So every time you move your head in space, your eyes move to keep your eyes pointed at the same place in space. They're important for posture. They're important for our perception of how we're moving. And as I'll talk about in a bit, that's very important during piloting tasks, especially like landing. My research sits at the intersection of clinical improving clinical practice, aerospace, and improving aerospace safety, and then basic science. And I really find that there's a symbiosis between the three, that doing one helps do the other. And I'll just give you one example. I'm sure you've all heard of the audiogram. We've been working with something we like to call the vestibulogram, and it's a test to find the smallest motion that somebody can reliably sense. And so, for example, we'll put someone on a motorized platform and translate them either to the left or the right, or tilt them either to the left or the right, and ask them which way did you move. And if they're getting them all right, we'll give them smaller motions. If they're getting too many wrong, we'll give them bigger motions, and we'll find the size of motion which they can reliably sense. We found that this test is more sensitive than existing tests of the vestibular system. We've used it to show that performance in that test is correlated with how well people do in a balance test. It's important for aging. It demonstrates aging effects, but it also demonstrates performance in a piloting task. So we had people do a task where they were in the dark, they were on a chair with a joystick, and the chair was randomly moving, and they had to use the joystick to, bring themselves back up to upright. And we found that people who did better on the vestibulogram test also did better in the piloting task. And so when you think about landing errors, whether it's landing on the moon, landing on Mars, landing on Earth, those are critical safety risks. You can't get that wrong. And there have been cases where errors were made where the limits of the space shuttle were tested and almost exceeded. So it's plausible that human errors in piloting could lead to accidents. And so what we found is that we potentially have a new test that could inform which individuals might be better which individuals might need more training, perhaps, to do a landing task. I'll just, well, let me wrap up there. And then if there's more questions, I can talk about more later.
Okay, great. Thanks, Faisal.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to go into the question and answer part, which is really the heart of the Science Cafe. It's the interchange between the audience and the experts. We will start off with the first question, which is, what do you think is the toughest challenge of space travel? And we will start with Jay, who probably has a long list, having been one of those people that sits on the top of the rocket fuel. But what do you think, Jay? Toughest challenge of space travel?
So I think what I want to talk about is the toughest challenge that Mars exploration, travel to Mars presents. And one of the ones, I have a top three, but I think the one that I think about the most is radiation. And when you think about radiation when you're going to Mars, you have to think about it a little bit differently than you think about radiation here on Earth. So the radiation that you get, let's say when you go to the doctor, is like high energy light. The example would be, if you go out in the sun and you get a sunburn, that's kind of like radiation exposure. Your skin, all of your skin gets a lot of energy and you get a rash. But there's another kind of radiation that you get when you're outside of Earth's magnetic field on the way to another planet, and that's called galactic cosmic radiation. And that radiation is like little bullets. So instead of your skin getting a rash, it's like a lot of little bullets hitting that actually kill cells. And where that becomes important is in your brain. So if you spend a lot of time on your way to Mars or on your way back from Mars, during that time, you're getting exposed to this galactic cosmic radiation, which is going to start to kill cells in your brain. And so protecting from that kind of radiation is very important, but also it's very hard to do. And just putting up a shield is often not enough. Like if you go to the dentist, they might wear a lead apron, right? Because the lead will stop the radiation. But if you're wearing a lead apron and you get hit by a galactic cosmic ray, that galactic cosmic ray may hit the lead and then create little secondary radiation that comes out, and you might actually increase your radiation exposure by being behind that lead. So shielding is very important for the spacecraft, and also finding a way to protect people while they're on the surface of Mars so that they're not spending all their time underground. So I think radiation is very important. And then my number 2 and 3 is bones and muscles and the psychological aspects of isolation and confinement.
Great, thank you. I think we're well on our way to developing our own TV show here. So next, Faisal, what do you see as the toughest challenge to space travel?
So maybe I'll have 2 as well. So I think one is neurological. I think, I know obviously I'm biased by what I study, but I think our ability to do tasks in space, we repeatedly see people coming back after 6 months and having to be carried off a spacecraft. And if you're going to Mars and you have a bunch of tasks to complete as soon as you arrive, if people have problems walking with gait, that could be a major risk. I think another one I would say is systems, that it's not an individual risk that might be the problem, but it's interactions between risks. So it might not be the vestibular system on its own, but the vestibular system combined with cognitive challenges, sleep challenges, radiation damage. I think all of those things together, individually, they might not be enough to become a major challenge. But when you bring them all together, they can either sum or they could, nobody likes the word synergy, but they could synergistically come together to create risks to the mission and challenges.
Okay, thanks. Well, I hope we come back to that because I'd be more interested in hearing some more about that. Now, Susan, your turn. What do you think is the toughest challenge? Yeah, I think you're muted.
There, is that better?
Yes, yep,
I'm
that's
sorry.
fine. That's fine.
Yeah, I was just saying that I would certainly agree with radiation being the primary risk and most challenging thing there is about space travel as we get out of low Earth orbit, and as we just heard about that, there are different types and much more damaging types of radiation in space that the astronauts will be exposed to as they travel to the moon and on to Mars, and then try to stay in those places for extended periods of time. And even in the spacecraft, because of the shielding, again, there are secondary particles that come off and make the situation even worse. So those are to me the biggest challenges, and it affects the brain, of course, but it also affects a lot of other things. We see a lot of DNA damage just in the blood, is where we have looked before, and things that chromosome rearrangements that increased risk of cancer. I mean, I think that is one of the biggest things. And you might say, well, cancer takes a while. It's not going to influence an astronaut's health. But on these long duration missions, there's the possibility within 4 to 5 years, leukemias come up. Some things like that could very much influence the health of an astronaut during a mission and his performance. Things like dementias and other kinds of neurological influences as well that we've also heard about would result from radiation exposure, and that certainly would influence astronaut performance during a mission and could compromise a long duration mission. So I would vote for radiation, and that's really one of our toughest challenges.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you. I didn't know some of that stuff, so I hope we get a chance to talk more about that. Laura, same question. What do you think is the toughest challenge of space travel?
Well, in the Division of Sleep Medicine, we think everything revolves around sleep. So I wouldn't be representing the division well if I didn't say that I think sleep is one of the major challenges. We found on the International Space Station and on the shuttle that astronauts only averaged about 6 hours of sleep per night. And we originally thought that would be true on the shuttle, where it was just 2-week missions. And, there's a lot of I'll sleep when I'm dead and, attitude that I don't need sleep. But we found even on the 6-month missions that the average sleep duration was just 6 hours a night. And we know from our research on the ground that is not enough sleep to maintain performance, which is super important on spaceflight missions. Also, sleep deficiency affects all other, psychological parameters, mood, teamwork. Who hasn't lost sleep and been a little bit grumpy? And so when you're thinking about a 3-year mission to Mars, and if you are losing sleep, sleep deficiency builds up into a sleep debt. And so performance could be an issue. Getting along with other crew members could be an issue. So I think sleep is really important. Also, going to Mars, you're going to have the circadian misalignment of living on a 24.6-hour day that I had mentioned before. I think one of the good things about sleep is that there are countermeasures that we are working with on the International Space Station right now to see whether we can improve circadian alignment and improve sleep of the crew members using different colored lights that can help circadian entrainment. When we studied sleep, the biggest countermeasure was sleep-promoting medications. We found out 75% of the astronauts took sleep-promoting medications in space on more than half the nights on shuttle missions, and on 17% of the nights, they took 2 doses of sleep medication. So one to fall asleep, and then one when they woke up a few hours later, took a second dose. And so those can have severe consequences on performance as well. So our goal is to work to find countermeasures to improve sleep. And that might be an easier task than to try to change radiation exposure.
Wow. Okay, great. That's very interesting. And I think if you had a program where you said you could sign up and guarantee 6 hours of sleep a night, I would sign up for that. Thank you for the information. Okay, so moving on, the first question we have from the audience is from David Hutton. And where does the planning for human travel to Mars stand? Who would like that one?
Boy, I don't know. I mean, I could say that they have just recently named the astronauts to the Artemis project and for going back to the moon. So that certainly is an important step. They haven't named the actual astronauts yet, but they do have the core. So that's certainly a step in the right direction. So I don't know. I mean, perhaps somebody else. Jay, do you know anything specific about their plans, concrete plans? I think they're saying by the mid-20s, maybe going to Mars.
Yeah, no, I don't know anything about the concrete plans, but I do know that just some principles. I mean, the thing is that just getting off the Earth is really the biggest and most energy consuming part of the trip. I mean, once you've gotten into Earth orbit, it takes about the same amount of extra energy to go to the moon as it does to go to Mars. So it's really getting all this stuff into low Earth orbit that's the challenge, and then getting it to Mars is also a challenge. But it's something that's been going on since the 1970s. Remember, we had Viking landers on Mars in the 70s. So it is possible to send things to Mars. The challenge is getting all that stuff into Earth orbit, and then there's the challenge of having enough mass and material to be able to support people for a period of time. And then, of course, my concern is a good radiation protection. And one area that I think we're not working on is looking at the use of magnetic fields in order to prevent the galactic radiation. So that's why we don't have galactic radiation here on Earth. Causing us problems is because we're protected by the Earth's magnetic field. So there's always been the idea out there that why don't we create our own little magnetic field around a spacecraft or on the surface of Mars in order to try to reduce the galactic cosmic radiation dose. But that's a very difficult technical challenge that might be easier now with the availability of high temperature superconductors and the advances in technologies that have occurred. So it is possible that we could perhaps take on that problem, which previously had been really seemed to be insolvable. Also, the other way to shield things is just put a lot of mass, like things would have a lot of hydrogen, like water or plastic, are the kind of shields that you would use, if you're not going to put a magnetic field around your spacecraft.
All things that are very heavy and very difficult to get into orbit and to Mars. I mean, that's always a problem.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, David, for asking that question. Our next question is from DJ. Is it possible to terraform Mars in the future?
Boy.
I'm happy to take that one. So is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. I mean, so the thing is that why Earth has an atmosphere, right? The reason we have this atmosphere around us is that Earth is big enough, has enough gravity to hold on to the atmosphere. Mars got shortchanged in the planetary formation time. It was too close to Jupiter, didn't have enough stuff around to create a really big planet. So it's smaller than the Earth, and as a result has a smaller gravitational field, and so has a harder time holding on to an atmosphere. But it still has an atmosphere on Mars. It's very thin, and it's mostly carbon dioxide. But in the past, it had a thicker atmosphere, and it probably had some oxygen. So it is possible if you can produce the gases on Mars to gradually build up an atmosphere. So it's probably possible. Is it practical? It would be quite an undertaking.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Molly Forgard. Can any of you speak to space blindness, CSF buildup deforming the back of the eye? Do we have a guess about whether or not the Mars gravity is strong enough to prevent it? Who would like that one?
You know, I'm sorry to keep jumping in on these, but this is one of the areas we do research on. Just a couple of things. Well, it's not that people go blind. Just they have their vision changes like it does if you get a new glasses prescription. You know, so like when your old eyeglasses aren't working anymore, things are a little blurry. Well, that's what's happening to people in space. Their vision is becoming blurry, and it is correctable with glasses. But the reason it's happening is that the eye is getting shorter. It does look as if it's getting pushed from behind. And because of that, people have suggested that it must be because they have high pressures of the fluids in their head. And that's been the theory that's been out there. I would say that the group that I'm with doesn't really support the idea that there are high pressures in the head. There's a lot of evidence to think that that's not what's really causing it, but it's an imbalance in the pressure across the back of the eye that over time is causing it to get a little shorter and to get a little squished. So the fascinating thing about that is nobody really knows exactly why it's happening in space. I'm hopeful that then with the next couple of years, we can come up with a better theory about why it's occurring and what we can do to prevent it from happening. So far, it hasn't caused any serious problems. Everything that's happened has been correctable with glasses, but it is a little scary to have this physiological problem going on in your head that nobody really understands.
Interesting. So is it a cause because of the space travel, or is it a congenitive problem?
No, it's a unique effect of microgravity. That's what makes it so fascinating. It's not something that happens this way on Earth. And there are two things that happen in weightlessness that you just doesn't happen here on Earth. Here on Earth, whether you're standing up or lying down, there are always some pressures in the fluids in your body due to gravity. It's a hydrostatic pressure, the same pressure that, you know, if you put your finger on a straw, you know, you draw some water in the straw, put your finger on it, you know, the water will stay there, but then when you take your finger off, it falls out. Well, its gravity is creating that pressure on the water to make it fall. And so we have those pressures in our fluids throughout our body. And then the other thing that does is that those pressures, that gravitational pressure on our body also compresses our tissues. And so when you go into space, those pressures are released. Those compressive forces are released. And what you see is actually a reduction in pressures in the body as a result of this, the release of these different gravitational pressures, gravitationally caused pressures. And that's not something that happens here on Earth. That's not something that you can actually replicate. The unique effect of microgravity.
Great. Thank you, Jay. Moving on to the next question from YT Ed from New Hampshire. We hear a lot about medical issues that space travel may cause. Are there any medical benefits to being in space?
Well, didn't we hear that sometimes you come back a little bit taller because of the lack of gravity? It doesn't last, but...
That's what Scott Kelly said, isn't it? That he was taller when he got back than his brother.
Right, for a little while at least.
For a little while.
Yeah. So along those lines, if you have disc disease, so let's say you've got a disc in your spine that's compressing a nerve, microgravity is the thing for you. It's what it does. Right now, standing here, I have gravitational forces on my spine. It's what makes me a little shorter during the day than I am when I first wake up in the morning, because when you're lying down, those gravitational forces are released. So when you go into space, you get taller because the pressure on the spine is relieved, but it goes away when you come back. But if you had a disc, that was causing you problems, the loss of going into space would relieve the pressure on that disc and might make your leg pain feel better.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, Susan, Did only one of the astronauts get taller, or did they both? The
Well,
twins.
no, Scott was saying that when he got back, yeah, he was a couple inches taller than Mark. But as Jay was just saying, coming back to gravity, it doesn't take long for that to also go away. I was also going to just mention that for the twin study and for the other astronauts as well, we've also found that instead of telomeres shortening during space flight, which is what we imagined would happen because of all the stresses and exposures that they experience, they actually had longer telomeres during space flight. And it was very, very specific for space flight. It happened in a number of all of the crew member for whom we had in-flight samples for. So of course there was a big buzz about that, because does that mean that it's like a fountain of youth? Oh my gosh, if we can maintain telomere length and even get it longer during space flight, is that the answer to aging? And sadly, I don't believe that it is, just because, like many things, there's the other side of the coin, and that is that when they came back, their telomere length shortened very, very rapidly, and they ended up with more short telomeres than they had to start with. But during spaceflight, I mean, one of a real risk factor for developing cancer is actually longer telomeres, because cells that are mutated perhaps because of radiation exposure now actually survive much longer because they have longer telomeres. So everything comes with a little bit of a yin and yang to it, but that might be another thing that could be interpreted as something good.
Great, thank you. Okay.
They float around all over. It looks like they're having a grand old time.
Next question from Thorn Blomquist. What materials do a better job of inhibiting galactic radiation? We may have covered part of this.
Yeah, Jay mentioned a little bit about how things like water, concrete, lead, things like that are very effective at shielding radiation, but they're very impractical for space travel because of their weight. So that's, they're always trying to come up with some kind of shielding that's more effective, and that you don't get this effect of the secondary particles interacting with your shielding and actually exposing the crew members to more radiation than they would have had outside.
Great.
Do you have other comments on that, Jay?
Yeah, so the galactic cosmic ray is actually, it's like the nucleus of an atom. So it's from an atomic point of view, it's pretty big compared to other kinds of radiation, and it has a charge, so it's got an electrical charge, and it's traveling super fast. So what happens is, if it hits another atom, let's say an atom of lead, it can hit that atom of lead and it can produce more radiation. So it'll what's called secondary radiation. So if you use a lead shield, you can actually increase the amount of radiation inside the spacecraft because of all these hits that the galactic cosmic rays have with the other atoms in the shield. So the benefit is to use a shield where the atoms are really small, and the smallest atom you can get is hydrogen, right? Number 1 on the atomic number. And so things that have a lot of hydrogen in them are good as shields for galactic cosmic radiation, because it really minimizes the amount of interactions you have with other nuclei. And so that's why things like water or plastic are often put forward as being shields. And then the other thing is that since it has a charge, if you can put a magnetic field around the spacecraft, you can deflect it. But I don't want to soft pedal the technical challenge that prevents, because it's going fast. It has to be a magnetic field, but deflect galactic cosmic ray.
Yeah, I have heard that the Russians on the space station will put their, they for showering and cleaning, they will have the wipes with water in them, and they line their sleeping compartments with with those wipes, so that they have that water and plastic around them. So I believe that that's true, but that is one of the things. I mean, it just shows you how technically challenging it is. That's the kind of stuff that they do.
Wow, fascinating. So, Jay, since you actually were the astronaut, what differences or what advances have we made in protection from radiation?
Oh, you're muted, Jay.
Oh,
Yeah. So for the we haven't made any kind of progress in dealing with galactic cosmic radiation, but as far as dealing with the other kind of radiation that is a concern when you're going to the moon, or for a short period of time, or when you're in low Earth orbit, is from a solar flare. And I don't know if you're familiar with James Michener. Wrote a book called Space, and in the book, what it presents a scenario that what could have happened, which was that he proposed there being astronauts on the surface of the moon when a solar flare took place, and solar flare has a lot of high energy protons. And they travel from the sun, and if they were to hit the moon, depending on how big the solar flare was, while people are outside of a spacecraft and they're just in their spacesuits, they could get fatal doses of radiation. So there's a lot of effort to try to have what are called storm shelters, where people can go if there is a solar flare, in order to get some protection from the solar flare, when those occur. So there's a lot of effort on being able to predict solar flares, and then to have a storm shelter for people to go into if there is a solar flare. Fortunately, it's not that hard to protect against protons, but so you just need a little bit of shielding and you'll be okay. But the key thing is not to be out on the surface of the moon, walking around, and have it take longer for you to get back to your spacecraft than it takes for the protons to get to the surface of the moon.
Great, thank you. So our next question, what are the health effects of microgravity or lack of gravity? And do we have the technology to create gravity to counteract those health effects?
I could take a stab at that. I think we've talked a lot about radiation and the risks to the body, to the risks of cancer. Some others that occur are loss of bone mass. So without stresses on the body, the bone starts to deteriorate. There's also muscle loss without stresses on the body and microgravity. And then there's all the neurological ones. So the vestibular system has one component, which is called the otolith organs, and they sense the sum of linear acceleration and gravity. And so they're constantly sensing down when we're on Earth, as well as linear motion of our head. When we go into space, they're no longer sensing gravity because it's not present. And so all the responses in our body, like postural control, that depend on our ability to stay upright relative to gravity, no longer are appropriate there. And so the brain actually starts to change the way it processes those signals. In terms of what can be done to counteract, I think there's three main ideas or technologies that have been proposed. One is centrifugation, so actually spinning to create artificial gravity by creating a centripetal acceleration. A second is exercise, and a third is training. So let me go a bit more into those. With centrifugation, one way we've all heard of is that you spin the entire spacecraft at a constant angular velocity, and then people orient themselves so that their feet are to the outside of the spacecraft. That's technologically very challenging. Another idea people have talked about is short radius centrifugation. So you have a small centrifuge, maybe 1 or 2 meters on the spacecraft, and astronauts may spend an hour a day or so under centrifugation to give that pulse of artificial gravity that might trigger their body to say, oh, I better not lose all these abilities. it's common now. I mean, it's standard now on spacecraft to do exercise. So yeah, you've probably all seen the treadmills on the spacecraft with elastic straps holding the astronauts down so that they can run and their body is subjected to the same forces that they would be on Earth. And then the third is training. So, for example, for the vestibular system, exposure to different stimuli, flying in high-performance jets, centrifugation on Earth, all of those can make the brain more adaptable. And there's actually experiments that have showed that if the brain is subject to 3 different environments, it'll adapt better to the 4th environment. It's triggered to have more compensation ability, or what we call plasticity. So I think those are my thoughts, but maybe others have more.
Great, thank you, Faisal. Anybody else? Okay, let's go on to the next question. Question from David Hutton. For Dr. Bailey, has much of the research on the Kellys been published yet? And can you comment on the most significant findings so far?
Yes, well, thank you for that question. And yes, the twin study has been published. The initial report came out in Science in April of 2019. And for us, the most exciting and kind of different result was the one I referred to earlier, where we saw longer telomeres during spaceflight than before or after. And that was in Scott Kelly. So more recently, and a number of the other twins investigators as well, had a lot of other results that we weren't able to put in that initial report. So those reports came out, many of them came out together in December, this past December, across Cell Press. So in Cell and Cell Reports, there are close to 30 papers that came out that report on all kinds of different things related to the twin study, but also just about spaceflight in general and the health effects of spaceflight. So I would turn your attention to those. And certainly there's an overview article, in fact, in Cell in the December issue that really highlights all of the features of spaceflight, which included this change in telomere length dynamics, as well as DNA damage as a result of radiation exposure. And that would be, again, some of the cytogenetic work that we did on chromosomes showing increased inversions, or a particular type of rearrangement for the chromosomes during spaceflight. And the thing about those was that in fact it seemed to continue after they got back. It's just that they don't go away, really. I shouldn't say continue, but those frequencies of those aberrations continued after they got back. So really indicative of some kind of genomic instability, which again is something that we propose really needs to be monitored in the astronauts.
Great, thank you, Susan. So is the study complete, or can we look forward to more findings?
The study is complete, yes, and our second one with our 10 astronauts is also complete. So all of those results are now published. Going forward, we're looking forward to recruiting more astronauts for the upcoming missions on the ISS.
Great, thank you. And thank you, David, for that question. Next question. Is there an impact to the circadian rhythm in space? And if so, what is it? I think, Laura, you're up.
Okay, there's space flight. The environment creates challenges to the circadian rhythms. Our sleep-wake schedule and late-dark schedule are aligned here on Earth when we work a day shift, and everything is great. In space, in low Earth orbit, instead of a 24-hour light-dark cycle, they have a 90-minute light-dark cycle, so 16 sunrises and sunsets each day. And so keeping aligned to a 24-hour schedule can be difficult, especially if the lighting isn't bright enough. Light is the most powerful time cue to the circadian system. So insufficiently intense or inappropriately timed light can wreak havoc with the circadian system and cause misalignment. So we're working right now on some lighting in space. It's getting tested right now where it is longer wavelength, so redder light in the pre-sleep hours, and shorter wavelength light, blue and green light, to increase alertness during the day and to help facilitate keeping the crew members entrained that 24-hour day. There's also some manufactured challenges in the schedules that sometimes they have. I don't know, Jay, on your flight, I think they were living like on a 23.5-hour day, just because you have to launch at a certain time, you have to land at a certain time, you have to be awake at certain times, and so they manipulate the schedules. We know that the best way to induce insomnia is to put somebody into a laboratory and keep them on a 23.5-hour day. So that was going on some missions. A lot of times there were abrupt shifts in the sleep-wake schedule. So because an incoming, like say the shuttle was coming up to dock with the ISS, those ISS crew members had to be awake for that docking to occur. And so if they were on a different schedule, they would abruptly shift their sleep-wake schedule by 7 hours so that they could be awake for that landing vehicle, and then they would shift back. So there was a lot of shifting. And when we looked at a mathematical model of when crew members were aligned versus circadianly misaligned, we found that they slept less when they were misaligned, and they were misaligned 20% of the time on ISS missions. They also took more medications, not just sleep-promoting medications, but all medications in general when there was misalignment. So we're working on some of those lighting countermeasures to help keep astronauts entrained, and it's going to be super important going to Mars, especially if they're going to be living on the 24.6-hour day when they get there.
Wow, thank you. Okay, the next question, we're sticking with the sleep topic here. What is the impact of space travel on sleep? What factors of travel, like the lack of gravity, play the greatest role in sleep problems? And would something like melatonin or sleeping pills help? Or you mentioned they take some sort of sleep medication. What would those be?
So we found that sleep duration was reduced from pre-flight to in-flight, it was reduced by at least a half hour. And when they came back, they slept an hour longer. So we know that sleep debt was occurring in space. Like I said, they used a lot of sleep-promoting medications. When we looked at nights where they took medications versus not taking medications, we didn't see a difference in the sleep duration. There was, when the nights they took sleep medications, there was a subjective reporting of falling asleep faster. So that might be one of the reasons that they are taking the medications. As far as melatonin goes, we did a study of melatonin in space, and it wasn't helpful. I think because melatonin, we find even here on Earth, it's helpful when you're trying to sleep when you are misaligned. So if you're a night shift worker trying to sleep during the day, melatonin is helpful to promote sleep at that time. But if you're a day shift worker and just taking melatonin before you go to sleep at night, when your melatonin is naturally rising, we don't find it to be any more effective. And then as far as what we found to be the biggest cause of sleep disruption, when we asked crew members, why was your sleep disturbed? 10% said it was too hot, 10% said it was too cold, 20% said it was too noisy. On some of the sleep stations that they have on ISS now, the private sleep quarters, some said that if you left the door shut, it was too hot. If you left the door open, it was too noisy. So it's a lot of environmental issues that were present back in the Apollo era and still today exist. I don't know, Jay, if you have anything else to add about, personally how you slept in space. That's just the overall of the 100 astronauts we studied.
Yeah. No, it's a little disconcerting actually initially to get in space because you're floating, above you're used to on Earth sinking into the pillow and settling into the mattress, and there you're just floating above it. So I actually put things underneath my sleeping bag, so I felt like I had something pressing against my back. And but then you adapt to it, and you're able to get to sleep. And I actually took part in a melatonin study. That was a neurolab experiment looking at whether melatonin or a placebo was effective for helping with sleep.
Well, and so Jay, how long was your mission? How many days did you spend up there?
Our mission was 16 days. It was a 16-day space lab mission. So we had a space lab module, which is back in the back of the shuttle. And then we had 26 experiments totally devoted to studying the brain and the nervous system and how it adapts to weightlessness and then readapts to being back on Earth.
Oh, great. Thank you. Okay, the next question, what is the impact of space travel on balance, perception, and motion?
Shall I give it a shot?
Sure.
All right. So maybe I can do this through a few examples. So let's talk about perception first. And I mentioned these parts of the vestibular system called the otolith organ, and that they measure the sum of linear translation and tilt relative to gravity. And one thing Einstein postulated was that there is no way to tell apart those two. And our phones have the same issue. The accelerometer can't tell apart tilt and translation. And so our brain uses some tricks to tell when it gets a stimulus. Is it a tilt or is it a translation? And those tricks, one of the tricks it uses is if it's a very rapid motion, it's probably a translation. If it's sustained, then that is probably a tilt. But when you go into space and you no longer have tilts, the brain slowly decides that any stimulation to the otolith organ must be a translation. And so when you come back from space and now you have these tilts going on again, the brain interprets those quickly as translation. And I know many astronauts have experienced this, but after I did parabolic flight, I also experienced it that I think I was in the shower washing my hair and I tilted my head forward and felt a sudden upward acceleration. And so that's just one example of how perception is affected. And one thing I should say is these effects are very strong initially, and then after 1, 2, 3 days, the brain is pretty good at adapting many of these effects. And then also on the other end, that there's a lot of effects when people come back from space, but after a couple of days, many of them have gone away. Another interesting area is navigation, right? Our ability to orient ourselves in space also has different challenges in microgravity. And one people often talk about is if somebody's working in a module in the space station, for example, and then another person enters and they just happen to be in the opposite orientation, there's a sudden confusion about where is up and where is down. Because for both of those individuals, they probably thought their feet were down. All of a sudden, they're seeing something that doesn't agree with that. And there's reports of people feeling suddenly very motion sick just by having that, what's called a visual reorientation illusion. In terms of balance, balance isn't very important in microgravity. But for example, when you go to the moon, balance becomes important again. When you come back to Earth, balance becomes very important again. And those effects that I mentioned with changes in how the brain interprets tilt versus translation feed into our ability to control balance. And the other part about balance that I'm personally interested in is in 1G, when our body tilts and our brain uses that information about tilt to control our muscles to bring it back to upright, we've got a certain amount of force. But on the moon, you would need 6 times the tilt to get the same force on the vestibular organs. And so, we postulate that people would be more likely to fall in lower gravity because the forces on the otolith organs are less. So those are a couple of thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Faisal. Anybody else want to comment? Okay, we'll go on to the next question. You want to do, we're actually running out of time, so we're probably going to try and get 2 more questions in, and then we'll go to the comments and the closings. So the next question is, what causes the sleep disturbance in space travel?
Well, I think it's a host of reasons. Like I said, there can be circadian challenges, and we know you sleep less when you're circadianly misaligned here on Earth and in space. The environmental challenges, and then there's also some behavioral challenges. On the ISS, when the astronauts had their private sleep quarters and they had a laptop in there, we know that a lot of times the last things that they would do at night is to email family and friends, and so they're on their computers. So some of the same challenges we have here on Earth, putting our technology away, avoiding light in the evening that can promote sleep, I think would be helpful in space as well. But I think it's not just one thing that causes the sleep disturbance in space travel, but a bunch of different reasons.
Okay, thank you. We might have 2 more. Next question. Oops, excuse me, Scott. We hear a lot about medical issues that space travel may cause. Are there any medical? Oh no, we did that one, didn't we? Benefits to being in space. We did that one. What would happen if Sagittarius A disappeared? I don't even know what that question means. Ideas? Somebody want to tell me what Sagittarius A is? Okay, we're going to move on to the last questions. We are after 8 o'clock already. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and we actually have a lot of questions left. But last question. Knowing the risks, would you join a trip to the moon, Mars, or elsewhere? Jay, do you want to tell us, you want to give us a scoop and tell us which one of these you're signed up for already?
Yeah, so I'm not signed up for any. I was very fortunate to have the mission I had, so I think it's going to be exciting. We have a whole new generation of people who are going to be doing these things. It's exciting to see the new astronauts come in and know that these might be the people who go to the moon and then potentially to Mars. So that's pretty exciting. So the moon is a lot easier to get to. The Mars is a lot more interesting.
So, Susan, are we going to see you in space anytime soon?
Absolutely not. I got busy just listening to this talk about what was happening to your ears and stuff. But yeah, I wish I could, but boy, I love watching it, and I'm so excited about seeing, as Jay was pointing out, our next generation, making their way to the moon again, back to the moon, and the first woman and next man back on the moon, and then on to Mars. It's an exciting time for the space program.
Great. Laura, I think you'd look good in one of those spacesuits.
I think I'll stay here on Earth with Susan and watch it and see the science behind it. We'll cheer them on.
Okay,
I didn't expect that. I'm all in. I'll take all of your seats if you don't want them. All right. My only hesitation would be that I have kids now, but I think they'll understand.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This went by so quickly. It was very fascinating. We are out of time. I said we have more questions, but we will have to get another schedule ahead for us. Thanks to the audience for participating in this, for tuning in, and for your questions. We appreciate it. That really does drive the direction of the Science Cafe. A very special thanks to the excellent panel that we had this evening. You've been very generous both with your time and your expertise, and it is truly appreciated. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Fun
for
having us.
Great. So the topic for next month is going to be very relevant. It is going to be the COVID-19 vaccine. And as a reminder to all the people in the audience, you can view tonight's session on YouTube pretty much immediately after we finish here. And you can also take a look at the library that we have there. There's about 50 sessions that we've taped in the last several years that you can take a look at. Wrapping up, thank you again. We will see you all on February 17th for the COVID-19 vaccine. Good evening and have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.